Hey, so here's an example of how we can make money while losing money. And then we'll talk about how we can use simplicity to start making money without losing money. So here's a standard example with some round numbers just to make it really easy. Let's say 10K was generated over a week's time. 3,500 bucks was the cost of goods on that, supposedly including all transaction fees, all fulfillment fees, everything all in. Ads were 3,500 bucks from Facebook and all channels. And so the contribution margin here backs out to 3K. Now, where this gets interesting is when we work with brands in our private program and we unpack these numbers and we unpack how things are being measured, things get a lot more nuanced, where we start to wonder, why isn't this 3K actually manifesting inside of the business to cover all the expenses that are needed? We start to wonder, why is profit disappearing despite on paper, all of it supposedly being there? So let me give some examples of unpacking these numbers into the nuances and what may happen. So an example with revenue that might be eating away at profit, which is pretty common, is that this revenue here on the 10K is actually inclusive of the revenue that you're making from taxes. So let's say you're selling in the EU, and the brands that we've worked with in the EU, taxes may represent up to 15% of revenue. So this 10K might actually be more like 8,500 if you take out the 1,500 that is generated through taxes. When it comes to cost of delivery, cost of goods, cost of fulfillment, a nuance here may be brands not counting the fact that it costs them money to fulfill to the customer. There are brands sometimes that say, we just pass off the cost of shipping to the customers, so we don't even track it. So this 3,500 number is actually excluding fulfillment numbers, which might be something like 7% of revenue. So in this case, this 3,500 is actually more accurately minus 4,200. And then with ads, as an example, it's not uncommon for brands to, let's say, spend most of their money with Facebook ads, but then there's like a trickle of spend that's happening with Google ads. And that trickle might be something like $50 a day. So this 3,500 is actually more like 3,850. So what ends up happening is this contribution margin number, which is responsible for covering all the fixed costs, software, team, agency, your salary, your dividends, ends up only being 450 instead of 3K. So there's three reasons why scenarios like this can happen, and they're pretty simple to solve. Reason number one is just no tracking at all, or rather no measurement in tracking, which is pretty simple to solve. And the solution there is to just start. And to elaborate on what I mean by that, it's where brands are only looking at, let's say, Shopify revenue, and then looking at Facebook revenue, and then having no consistent process for looking at how the numbers actually shake out when it comes to, I made this much in Shopify, but then they're not exactly sure of how much they're paying in cost of goods. They're not actually super clear on how much they're paying in fulfillment and transaction fees. And there's no system for ensuring that the contribution margin dollars over here are actually either healthy enough to cover all the expenses or not getting eaten away by bleeding initiatives. So reason number one is no measurement and tracking at all and lacking a process. Reason number two is measuring, but without nuance. So as an example, just going up, it's sort of the little things, the little details, right? Like in your revenue calculation, are you including taxes as far as what you have left over with your contribution margin? Are you taking out discounts, or are you using your gross number? Are you including or not including what customers are paying you for shipping? Because if you're not counting what you're getting for shipping, you might be undercounting your revenue. Are you pulling the right number? Or are you, let's say, for example, counting revenue from Facebook and not Shopify, where the attribution in Facebook can be problematic as far as their revenue reporting on what they've generated for you? So number 2 is all about the nuances and making sure that all the nuances are accounted for so that the numbers you are using are the clearest, cleanest, and most reliable that you can make decisions with. And then reason number 3 is a simple one as well, which is tracking and then stopping. So just falling off and not being consistent with it and forgetting that keeping a pulse on the most important numbers of your business is actually a $10,000 an hour activity, where catching an issue like this reorients the decisions you make in your business and can be worth a year's worth of profit if you catch it in time, especially when you start adding a 0 or 2 or 3 to this revenue number. So how we deal with this is to approach it with as much simplicity as possible. And that starts with defining what each of these numbers entail so that on a day-to-day basis or a week-to-week basis, your visibility on your contribution margin number is supremely clear. So with revenue, what we like is to use something called usable revenue, which is something that we made up. And that's just because it's the most accurate description, or rather a simple description of what it is that we're going for. And this can be most simply described as revenue that we keep. So it's revenue that is less taxes that you've collected and inclusive of removing everything that we're expecting to remove, such as your discounts and such as your refunds. Because what we're really going for is what was actually transacted. And then from what was transacted, what are we planning to keep? Then when it comes to cost of goods or cost of delivery / cost of fulfillment, whatever label you want to put on it, what we consider here is costs to serve the customer. And what we include in this is everything getting to the customer's door. So everything when it comes to your actual cost of goods, your pick, pack, and ship, your freight to get it over to your 3PL, any transaction fees you're paying to PayPal, Shopify Payments, Stripe, Authorize, whoever you're using, all of that we lump into this second category of cost of delivery. Then with ads, it's just everything that we're spending on marketing. So think about this as your platforms. So Facebook, Google, TikTok ads, Snapchat, all that sort of stuff. And then your contribution margin is everything that's left after you subtract these two, your cost of delivery and your ad cost, your marketing cost from your revenue. That's what's left in order to cover all of your expenses. By having definitions, it's kind of like having an agreement that you're signing, right? Whenever you're signing a legal agreement, there's a section in there that includes definitions of all the terms that are going to be used. When it comes to measuring and tracking your performance, it's a valuable exercise to do the same, where when we're defining what revenue is for the purpose of calculating our day-to-day or week-to-week contribution margin, or whatever metric you want to boil it down to, aligning on what that number actually is defined as is like 90% of solving issues around making money without losing it. A quote that I like to refer back to that is quoted quite often because I think it needs to be repeated and reminded of is "What gets measured gets managed" by Peter Drucker. And so the truth in that quote is that you will operate your brand and your business very differently when you see numbers like this over here, where you're only making $450 on $8,500 in revenue versus making $3,000 on $10,000 in revenue. The decisions you make in the two scenarios are very different, especially because these numbers are pre-accounting for all the other fixed expenses that you still have to use these numbers to pay for. Like these numbers need to cover your Shopify fee. They need to cover your own dividends and salary. They need to cover anybody you hired. And they also need to fund any new campaigns and experiments you want to run. So, as far as making money without losing money, starting point that we like to approach with simplicity is to start measuring it with simplicity itself.